haven't met for a long time, so let's review so we can understand what we're trying to do. This is a course called The Aspects in Spiritual Astrology. And the reason for the course is because in applied astrology, the aspects are the most important of all of the astrological elements, especially the aspects that have small orbs. They have the strongest influence in describing character.
Because that light's...
Okay. So we're going to spend several years studying aspects. Now, I have offered this course several times before, but not in the form that we're doing it now. All the previous offerings, it was primarily all the theory, the ideas that were behind the aspects and how you could look at the aspects. And in this case, this time through, it's going to be very slow because we're going to look at many, many, many horoscopes. And the idea is that the more horoscopes we look at, the more a person becomes familiar with astrology. It's been my observation that the astrologers that have the widest astrological vocabulary, it comes to them unconsciously from having looked at so many horoscopes. So what we're going to do is we're going to be very light and we're going to be very superficial, and we're just going to look at a few points in each of the horoscopes. This is different than the course we just finished, which was called Character Appreciation with Astrology. And in that course, we looked at only 16 horoscopes, but we looked at them for about 9 years. And so we were able to go into them more and more deeply. So we're trying something a little bit different this time around. Now, we started this series of talks looking at the aspects statically. We looked at geometric figures inscribed in a circle and the numbers that were associated with them through a method of gyres, which we don't need to go into now, so that we could understand the relationship of geometry and arithmetic, both of which have to do with the spiritual ideas that are behind the aspects. And so we looked at geometric figures as if the figure itself had a character to it. And in that way we could understand the nature of the aspect with the geometric figure. And then we looked at a lot of horoscopes. And we looked at horoscopes that were classics. For example, when we looked at the conjunction, we said that the number 1 is ruled by the Sun and by Saturn. The Sun representing general unity, and Saturn representing bringing something to one single point. And when we looked at the opposition, we looked at the two rulers, basic rulers of the opposition, that is Mercury and the Moon. So now what we have started, we're in the second section, which is called a dynamic approach to the aspects. And in this section, we are looking at aspects as turning points in a cycle, and that they represent when the activity of what is being done in that cycle, when it reaches a high point so that there is some kind of event or some type of specific activity that takes place, and then everything shifts on to something else. And what we did is we looked at the most basic cycle of all cycles, which is the lunation cycle, the cycle of the sun and the moon that we see every 28 days. And we looked at the aspects that are formed within that cycle, the conjunction, which is at the very beginning and at the very end, and then the sextile, which happens about 5 days later at the beginning of the cycle and 5 days before the end of the cycle. And so we noted the differences between the two aspects in the first half of the cycle, which we call the constructive half of the cycle, and in the second half of the cycle, which we call the destructive or the contemplative half of the cycle. And then we started looking at many, many horoscopes. We first looked at conjunction horoscopes, people who were born under a new moon, and then we looked at sextile between the sun and moon, and then when we left off last fall, we had looked at squares between the sun and the moon. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to look at people who have the sun trine the moon. And first we'll look at the constructive trines or the building trines, and we'll look at the people who had them and what it meant in their life, saying just a very few things. The whole class should take only about an hour. And maybe a few, only a few other little sidelong things. And we'll try to appreciate people and have fun at the same time. All right.
I have a question.
Yes.
I asked this before, so sorry.
Yeah.
When you look at a horoscope,
Mm-hmm.
you can tell if it's constructive or destructive.
Yeah.
How?
If the shortest distance between the sun and the moon is forward from the sun, it is constructive. And if the shortest distance from the sun to the moon is backwards, it is destructive. All right. You can say about the first trine is that it is when you have accomplished what you want to accomplish. You have success, because the cycle between the sun and the moon is the cycle of accomplishment. Everything is accomplished or finalized in our world through the cycle of the sun and the moon. We can take an example. We'll take an example of writing a poem. Everybody has at one time or another written a poem, and when you get the creative urge, which is still sort of dark in your consciousness, the inspiration to do that, that is like the new moon. When you actually start to write, and you're sort of basically playing around with the idea, you develop your first facility with the writing of the poem. Some people call first facility beginner's luck, and that's what the first sextile is like. Then, as you work on it, everything, when you do things in your mind, everything seems so easy, and you have the idea and you want to express it, but when you actually start materializing it or objectifying it in matter, problems arise, and those are indicated by the first square. And some of those problems, when you're writing, become blocks. And so the first square is a block that is not too dissimilar from a writer's block. But the adversarial activity of the first square requires that you make a major effort to overcome it. And that's sort of like the war effort in the Second World War. You had a challenge and you needed to overcome it. When you are materializing something and you're trying to finish it and you realize that there are problems and you're trying to give structure to those problems, that requires a period of incubation. And right after the first square is the incubatory period. We're going to talk about these things again and again, so you don't have to worry if you're not getting it right now. But Bertrand Russell wrote a lot of books on philosophy, and he would read the subject matter that he was going to write about, and he knew just how many weeks after he had read that the material would be ripe and that it would have incubated in his consciousness, and he would know just when to begin writing, because then the things would start flowing out of his unconscious being. The same thing is true in Narcissus and Goldman by Hess. Narcissus was the monk who did a lot of writing, and he talked about having an incubation period during which everything came right. Goldman, on the other hand, had the after effect. He had that after he had written something, he felt empty, and there was nothing he could do to fill his emptiness. So he usually tried to fill it with women, but that's what some people do. So the first trine is when you have actually written the poem. Then you give it to the critics, and the critics have at it, and then when that happens, you see it from the other person's point of view, which is like the opposition. And then the moon goes into decadence, and you have the second trine. And the second trine is like when the world takes your poem apart. Not so much that it's completely destroyed, but so that you can see things that are within it that weren't on the surface. And it's the same thing if you take your own poem apart. You realize that unconsciously beneath the surface you had things that you were saying that you didn't realize at the time you wrote the poem. And that's what the second trine is like. All right, now we're ready to start looking at horoscopes. Maybe sometime we'll actually look at William Blake's horoscope. This is the horoscope of a famous Christian minister named Norman Vincent Peale. We see Virgo rising, and we see the sun and two other planets in Gemini. So this is a very mercurial person, inwardly and outwardly. He was quite intellectually accomplished, though not necessarily deep. He wrote 23 different books, and he had a bi-monthly magazine, and he had a weekly syndicated news column, and he had a weekly TV show, and then he had his regular Sunday sermon. So he was extremely prolific, which you have to be a Gemini to do that, almost. His accomplishments that are mercurial aren't necessarily from Mercury. They're more from his identity in the sun in Gemini than they are from Mercury, because Mercury is in Taurus, which is not really noted for its speed and its ability to turn things out. His main accomplishment, though, was his life. He's most famous for a book and a way of life called The Power of Positive Thinking. And inherent in that is the fact that there's the possibility of negativity. And he is somebody that had to deal with a lot of negativity. The sun is opposite to Saturn, which is all kinds of doubt and self-negativity, and is conjoined to Pluto, which is also not famous for being bright and open and, and positive. But he overcame all of it. He overcame all of it by just thinking positively about everything, which he could do, because we can see that Jupiter is in the first house, and it is sextile to Uranus, so he would be innovative as far as positive thinking is concerned. However, most people didn't glom onto the positive part, they glommed onto the negative part, which was called the inferiority complex. And when I was a teen in high school, everybody told me, "Richard, you have an inferiority complex," and they made sure I had one, even if I didn't have one to begin with. They just hammered at me. And in those days, I really was somewhat of a negative person. But at any rate, he practiced what he preached, and he became a positive person. he accomplished in life, and he accomplished in life through the sun trine the moon. It's a first trine, and so it is his accomplishment. The second house is the fruits of his labors, and he's obviously somebody that is known by his fruits. So he was really quite successful. And it isn't, his great success was not because of his writing skill. His success was becoming positive. And he did it as an act of will. He used the sun conjoined Pluto not to be negative, but to be extremely positive about everything. And the thing was, he was a person that people who came around him were influenced to the better because he could basically lend his will to them until they had strength, and then he could retract it again. And this is basically what a spiritual healer does. The spiritual, because when a person is ill, they're in a point when they're very weak-willed. And a healer loans the will. And this goes all the way back to Paracelsus. Paracelsus wrote that very thing, that the healer lends will to the patient, and then later on takes it back again when the person is ready. This is a very healing horoscope in another way because Mars is sextile to Uranus. And it means that he could draw on something, to Neptune. He could draw on something hidden within himself and project a charisma out into the world.
Question.
Yes, sir.
That is what would be considered a constructive?
This is a constructive trine. All right. All of the first horoscopes, the first 5 are all constructive. All right. Since the trine represents spirit, I've taken quite a few people who are spiritually inclined people. The sun in this horoscope is in the 12th house, and it's conjoined the ascendant. And the sun is in a grand trine with Neptune and, of course, the moon, which is what we're looking at. And it's a very positive grand trine because it's in fire signs, which are probably the most positive of all signs. The ripeness is very interesting in his horoscope because it really played out in his life. When he was a young man, he, just for the heck of it, he tried meditating. And the very first time he meditated, he had a samadhi experience from right out of the gate. And he accomplished something that some people don't accomplish after a number of lives of working at it. And he did it right the first time out. So he really was ripe. And so he had worked on it from past lives, and he had brought himself to that. See, a person, in order to progress spiritually, has to have a balance between will and sensitivity and knowledge. If you have only knowledge, you are a literary spiritual person. If you have only sensitivity, you're a poor psychic and you're not in control of your life. If you have only will, you can overpower anything and be insensitive about it. You don't even have to know what you're doing. You can just do it by the power of will. But all of those things don't make for a balanced character, and they don't make for real progress. Now, most people are strong in 2 out of the 3, and among people that we meet, it's usually they're strong in knowledge and they're strong in sensitivity, and they're sensitive to what's happening to them, and they know what it means, but they don't have the will to do anything about it. In this case, the trine indicates balance, but he definitely needed to work on will. And so not only does he have the sun and 2 other planets in Leo, he has the sun square to Pluto. so he had to develop strength of will. And the way he did it is basically Pluto in the 9th house means he had to deal with reactionary religious attitudes. And so he had to reinvent spirituality in a country that has very ingrown attitudes about spirituality and look at it in a totally new way, which he was quite successful at. The moon in the horoscope is interesting. For one thing, it is void of course. And in spiritual people, that usually means a person who wants to do it on their own without the horoscope pushing them too much. In a normal person's life, having a moon void of course, the person never accomplishes anything because the instinct to finalize things isn't there. The void of course occurs when the moon does not culminate another aspect until it enters the next sign. And it's in the 29th degree of Sagittarius, and then it doesn't culminate an aspect until it enters into Capricorn and trines Venus. The situation is the sun trine the moon in this horoscope shows a good balance between the masculine and the feminine. The sun is the masculine, the moon is the feminine, and having them in trine indicates that he balances the masculine and feminine elements of his parts of his being very well. And the Venus is also trine to the moon, even though not culminated, which shows that this is somebody who is very sensitive to feminine things and works very well with them.
Question.
Yes.
Now, dealing with the constructive and is the other you said destructive?
Yep.
Okay. I assume that applies to all aspects.
Yes.
Okay.
So some of them it's applied, so you have to be a little careful. We'll come up to them eventually.
What I was curious about was in this case, Pluto
would be in a constructive square with the sun.
Still in the constructive square?
Yes, because the slower the distance from the slower moving planet to the faster one is the shortest distances forward in the zodiac.
Okay.
It's interesting that it wasn't a complete swim for him because Neptune is square to Mars and Uranus, so he did have to struggle with all kinds of unruly things and have conflict, like even in his inner spiritual work, it wasn't all trine. He had to do some work. When we study astrology, it's a good idea not to become too culture bound, because if we do, we're likely to misinterpret. There was a German astrologer who wrote about Pluto. His name was Brunhubner, and he was writing during and before the Second World War, and he was looking at the upcoming aspects of Pluto, and he said, on these days the race is going to be purged, meaning he thought that the Germans were going to win, and he was wrong every time because they lost, and the race really was being purged. That is a example of having a cultural bias, thinking that your society is superior to every other. The same thing happened to a lot of astrologers in the United States during the Vietnam War. They were predicting victories for the United States, and the times that came up was that the North Vietnamese always won. And some of them never did get the idea that maybe the United States was not the right party in that war. So this is somebody who was born with the first trine. And he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish, and he was very good at it. It's just that what he wanted to accomplish was not legal. He was a criminal organizer for the longshoremen. He was sort of the Jimmy Hoffa of longshoremen. I had a friend many years ago whose father was a longshoreman, and it was on occasion that Legs Diamond came to their house as a dinner guest. Pluto is the first planet in the first house, so he is what would be described as a heavy. Somebody that's a hard, heavy type of person. Pluto rules Scorpio, and there is that very strong conjunction of Saturn, Moon, and Uranus in Scorpio. So this is not somebody that plays tiddlywinks. The Pluto is strong enough to nullify any sensitivity from Mars. Now, the strength of what he did was accomplished because he worked behind the scenes. All the planets are below the horizon but Venus is in the 12th house, which is just as good as being below the horizon. Venus is in the house of undoing, and women were his undoing. Venus is square to Mars, so he was a man of very great sexual hunger. And with the planets in Scorpio, he was a very sexually avaricious man. He obviously used coercion, financial coercion from the second house to accomplish the labor organization of the sixth house. So you can see that the first trine worked very well for him, and it was it worked to achieve the ends that he wanted. He was not a nice man. He was a brutal man. He was famous for beating his girlfriends, and his demise was as he had a showgirl as a lover, and I think he may have beat her because he was in the act with her, and people came, his enemies came charging, and he died in the saddle, so to speak. That's it doesn't always have to be the house of undoing, but if you do undo yourself, the 12th house is the house that does it, yes. So he accomplished everything he wanted to accomplish. All right. If you have questions along the way, ask them. I'll probably not be able to answer them, but that's all right.
Exercise our questioning skills.
Mars and the Sun and Aries stand for heroes. The vernal equinoctial point, which is the beginning of Aries, by precession indicates what the heroes are. When it precessed through Taurus, the heroes were the merchants of Babylon that had their big caravans and they made all of their money. When it precessed into Aries, the equinox, the heroes were the champions. The champion was one person that would stand for the whole army, and two champions would have it out, and that would be the war. When the equinox precessed into the watery sign Pisces, it was the great navigators that were the heroes, Vasco da Gama and Cook and all of those people, and the clerics, the religious people, were the heroes. Now the equinox is precessing into Aquarius, and the heroes are scientists and astronauts, as the Aries sign representing space and such. This is the horoscope of an academic who wrote a very famous classical book that everybody in the arts or in the liberal arts had to read if you became a graduate student. It's called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So this was his big accomplishment, and it gave him prominence in the world. And so it made him noteworthy. Mars is opposite the ascendant, and he had a lot of hero's discontent himself. He wasn't content with the academic world. In fact, he was at odds with the academic world, as you can see with the Sun and Mercury and Jupiter being square to Neptune in the 9th house, which is the academic world. And so he was sort of out of step with them because of his spiritual views, which really weren't spiritual, they were psychological. He was a follower of Carl Jung. So in his discontent, he went for popularity. And Bill Moyers on public television had a very famous series of interviews with him about mythology. And he was indeed spiritually out of focus. The Pluto and Saturn are in trine, which indicates that even though there's a lot of raring to go fire in him, there was a lot of conservatism in him also. So he was quite conservative. And he decried the fact that there was no mythology in our times. And he saw that the social problems that our society has is because there was no mythology. Now, he didn't accept the principle of either dharma or of karma, that is, that there is a purpose for the time and that destiny is history is part of destiny, and that there might be a reason or a purpose for there being no mythology in our time. And because he was locked into Jungian thinking, which is basically symbolic thinking, which is inhibitive to spiritual growth, if you only do the study of Jung, because if you look at things through symbols, the symbol is always a material object. And in our times, even before our times, the great Jakob Böhme, the Teutonic philosopher, said that even though he knew the Bible by heart, he says, we have to do away with the Bible. Now's the time that we should be seeing the gods straightforward, and we should not be relying on books and on forms in that way. But Joseph Campbell couldn't accept that, and so he, even though he was quite accomplished in inspiring a lot of people to try to follow a psychological spiritual life, he never did get the point of that. It's interesting because I did 7 years of talks on mythology, and I did them in reaction to Joseph Campbell because I thought, man, this man needs to get away from this, from the Jungian approach, and to look at things more spiritually. It's kind of strange to look at this horoscope immediately after looking at the horoscope of Legs Diamond, because Legs Diamond served society unintentionally. The longshoremen still exist, but they're now purged of the crime, or pretty much purged of the crime. Joseph Campbell moved a lot of people, even though he may have been laboring under a misunderstanding about the nature of no mythology in our time. It's the character that endures, and not necessarily what the character is focused on. Rudolf Steiner, for example, points out that the great evolutionist Haeckel, in his previous life, before he was Haeckel, was a pope, and that he was a pope with as much earnestness as he was an atheistic Darwinist evolutionary figure, and the person was the same, even though the vehicle was different. All right. So This is the last one that we look at of the building trines. And this clearly, the second house is the house of objectification. And Cancer is the sign of images. And this is the horoscope that he was fabulously successful in the objectification of images. Probably one of the greatest artists that has ever lived. Now, the 10th house represents perspective. And Rembrandt was outstanding in his knowledge of perspective. People who study the psychology of art, there have been several books written on what is called the hidden dimension, such that an artist who knows how to do it on a flat painting can make that painting come to life and have dimensionality if you stand at a certain point and look at it. It jumps out at you as though it was third dimension. And people who make those kinds of studies claim that Rembrandt was indeed an expert at the hidden dimension. I had an experience with it myself in 1969 or 70. There was a Rembrandt show in Chicago, and I went with a friend, and it was one of those shows where they didn't allow you to spend time with a painting, and they kept you moving and kept you moving, and it was packed. And we came around the corner, and I was in just the right position, and the painting was called The Rape of Lucretia, and I immediately burst into tears because the painting was so clear and it carried out so much that it was really quite wonderful. This happens, in this case, Mercury is opposite Saturn. And Mercury is in a Cancer, which is not a good sign for words. And I wonder if his ability to be in the right hemisphere of the brain was so strong that it inhibited his verbal skills. I at one time talked with a doctor who was a brain surgeon who told me that if he spent several hours doing very careful brain surgery, when he would come out of the operating room, he could not talk because his consciousness was so much focused in the right hemisphere that he lost his ability to speak. This is a spectacular control horoscope. It's the closest that I have seen to a complete six-pointed star. If you begin with Saturn, Saturn sextiles Jupiter, Jupiter sextiles Pluto, Pluto sextiles Mercury. Neptune is just a little out of orb, but it is within orb with the Saturn. So those are 5 of the 6 points of a sextile. The fantasy element is from the Venus square Neptune, which played a part in his mythological studies. So obviously, the accomplishment is accomplished with professionalism, and it shows that the trine is something that fulfills purpose. And the 10th house finds purpose in the next house forward in that is trine to it, and that's the second house. And so professionalism finds purpose in productivity, and he was amazingly productive. All right. All right, now let's look at some horoscopes with the second trine. When the shortest distance from the slowest planet to the fastest planet is backwards in the zodiac. So this means that we're going to look at the trine that occurs right after the full moon. We've called that the destructive trine because the moon, which was filling up during the constructive period, is emptying and it's being broken down. And in some cases, it is more important to call it the assimilative trine, because it assimilates the conscious experience that was built in the first part of the cycle. It doesn't just break down, it takes that experience and, in this case, it universalizes it, taking it into consciousness. It's giving the light back to the sun. The whole cycle is always a shared activity. Sometimes the second half of the lunation cycle, like Dante the poet called the second half of the lunation cycle, he called it the contemplative life. The active life being the first half, the contemplative being the second half. All right. This is a horoscope that presents us with all kinds of problems. In the first place, we're looking at the horoscope of someone who is beginning to be beyond astrology. And beyond astrology works with principles. And beyond principles, there is life spirit, which is universal love. And this is somebody that draws on life spirit and somebody whose consciousness is going beyond astrology. The second problem with this horoscope is that this is a very highly developed individual. And people like ourselves that have normal consciousness, we can't always understand somebody whose consciousness is greater than our own. Of all of the people that I have met while in the flesh, I didn't talk to or meet her in that way personally, that I have seen in the flesh while the other person was in the flesh, this is probably the most advanced person that I've met under those circumstances. The sun and the moon are in a second trine. It's an unusual second trine in that they are both in Venusian signs. Plus, there are 3 other planets in Libra, which is another of the Venusian signs. So this is a person who is very, very loving. In this case, the second trine probably means a dissolving trine where healing is accomplished by using pure love to dissolve things that are hardened or that are crystallized. Now, this is a horoscope that is filled with sextiles and with trines, but it has some real trials to it. It's not necessarily an easy life. There are the squares of the moon to Pluto, Mars, and Venus, all up in the 12th house. This is, by the way, this is another horoscope of somebody who accomplishes this with the moon void, of course. And the moon in this case is in the last degree of Taurus, which is a degree of genius. So you can see that this is someone that I think it's someone who's trying to break down misnotions about love by putting forth the true flow of love. Somebody that, that Mars and Venus combination is usually a sexual combination, as we saw with Legs Diamond. And the moon square Pluto, it means somebody that has to work with obsessions. It doesn't necessarily mean that she has obsessions, because if you have a world figure, the thing that you're looking at are the things in the world, and the personal life interacts with them only to the degree that they are in the world. So it looks like a breaking down, because these are all second squares from the moon, the breaking down of attitudes of love in the world that are basically materializations or materialistic, like the objectification of bodies and things like that. Dissolving that and replacing it with love is probably what one of her greatest works is. Jupiter trines the planets in the 12th house, which shows that probably most of her activity is done, even though she has all that stuff to make her famous, most of her active accomplishing work is done outside of the body. I would say that especially the case with the 8th house, because people who have invisible helper experiences usually experience them through the 8th house rather than through the 12th house. And I have friends who have had 8th house meetings with her. The Uranus squares, especially to Uranus, doesn't have to be negative. It may mean that she's compounding the mystic and the occultist and doing it quite successfully. But what happens is she is so mystical that if you didn't know better, the way she laughs and the way she carries on, you'd think she was insane. Something like that. So, all right, so she is again founding with Uranus in the 9th house. She's even in a more radical way refounding religion in her time, or the Dharma, if you choose those words. All right. This is one of my favorite people in life. And the reason why is because I sometimes have a smutty mind. And I like somebody who has wit and that can use it in plain, harmless ways. This is the ventriloquist that created Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd, who now live in the Smithsonian Institution. In the radio days, he usually got the best of W.C. Fields, especially through Charlie McCarthy. If you can get some of those radio, I think you can get them on the net, some of those radio days things, Charlie McCarthy just really was excellent. There are 7 planets in air signs here. Sun, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, Moon, Mars, and Pluto are all in air signs. And which there are quite a few of them, 5 planets are in retreat houses. And 5 planets. The second trine seems to work by bringing about what he accomplishes indirectly. It's not like an assertion, like if the moon were in the 5th house, he would be asserting and he would be putting it out there. But it is by reflecting back that he accomplishes what he accomplishes. Obviously, with the Jupiter and the Sun in the 1st house, he's quite a positive person. But it is not, his humor was not overstatement, because the Saturn conjoined Mercury was stronger than the Jupiter conjoined the Sun, so his brevity and his terseness in his humor was a stronger factor than the hilarity. So there's a grand trine in this horoscope, in that the Sun and Moon and Jupiter all trine to Neptune. So there was, I don't know how to say it, Neptune can be sort of a fascination kind of quality, and I think that's what the grand trine represents. The Saturn and the Pluto in this horoscope are both excellently situated. They show a lot of discipline. Mars is trine Jupiter, so he has the practice and the discipline that he can accomplish what he wants to accomplish, and the Saturn means he can control his speech if he needs to. He's sort of a hero to me in a way that his life was unbelievable to me in one regard, in that he was a confirmed bachelor until quite an advanced age. And then he met his wife and instantaneously fell in love with her. And I think within 2 weeks of their meeting, they were married. And they were together for their entire life, and they never had an argument. Can you imagine that? And never.
I like to imagine. How old is he? How long did they live together?
Probably 40 or 50 years. Candace Bergman is their daughter. Yeah. And she's old already.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a love for those comedians. They say that there are two types of comedians. People who say funny things, which is what Edgar Bergen did, and the other Aquarius said things funny, and that was Jack Benny, and I liked him a lot too. I love the Aquarian humorists. All right, this is somebody that I don't like and I don't love, and because of that, you have to be careful of my prejudices or biases for what I'm going to say about this horoscope. This is a horoscope of a teacher from India. He was very much of a contemplative. He wrote excellent books. Even though I disagree with the man's life, he wrote excellent books on Vedantic metaphysics. So he really was a contemplative. He was so much of a contemplative that he had long periods of several years at a time of silence. So he was very much that way. His contemplations were energetic, as the Mars aspects show. The moon sextiles Mars, which sextiles the sun, which shows that everything that came out of that contemplation was energetic and he spoke forcefully. However, he had serious problems that I don't think a spiritual teacher should have. And they are all shown by the sun being square to Pluto and being square to Neptune. The square of the sun to Pluto shows that he was a man of power. He claimed, using a capital A, he claimed to be the absolute. And in his followers' life, he told them what to do and what not to do. And one of his followers was a friend of mine. And Mayor Baba appeared in my room and by a demonstration of power tried to convince me to be his follower, and all it did was completely turn me off. I wanted nothing to do with the man because it was just a raw demonstration of power. And if it's sort of like playing games. The Neptune square the sun shows that he was deluded about what he really was. I'll give you an example of how serious his delusion was. Now, this is a man that I can't say was not accomplished spiritually, because he really was in some ways. But he used to like to go to cowboy movies. But instead of saying, I like this as a relaxation and I enjoy going to cowboy movies, what he would say is, I am surreptitiously influencing the other people in the theater and improving their spiritual lives so that eventually they will become my followers. You can see why he's not a favorite of mine. Buckminster Fuller probably holds more patents than anybody else has in the patent office. This is a horoscope of a general creative genius. The moon is not only trine to the sun, it's trine to Jupiter, and they form a grand trine with Uranus, which is the inventor. So we have a real bona fide genius here. There are 5 aspects in that trine, and 3 of them are second aspects. The sun is in the 10th house, trining the planets in the second house. And that seems to be, the moon is in the 10th house, trying the planets in the 2nd house. And that seems to be saying that his creations and his inventions, the things that he objectifies, are reflections. Like he thinks on things and he gets a perspective on things, and in the reflections from that, the objects are born. And that's the way the second trine works for him. It's very different than Rembrandt. Rembrandt had the sun and the moon reversed, and his were projections. Like they were objectifications that were projections, and they weren't necessarily as much afterthoughts. Now this is interesting because this person was born about 15 months after Meher Baba. And so he has the same Neptune conjoined Pluto, only they're squared by the moon here instead of by the sun. And so what it is that in this case, he's trying to, in an impossible way, to manifest the invisible perfection of geometry in visible ways. And he realizes the impossibility of that, but what he's doing is something that has been very, very helpful to me in my life. And that is to try to solve impossible problems. And in the process of trying to solve impossible problems, what happens is all sorts of other things come out that are in the realm of possibility. And that is what he does. Like, for example, the whole history of mathematics is due to trying to solve 3 problems that cannot be solved. The squaring of the circle, the doubling of the cube, and the trisection of an angle using normal geometric tools. You can't solve those problems. And for centuries, people tried to solve them, and all the rest of the mathematics was born out of that. And so he's trying to solve geometric problems that you can't solve, but in the process, in the reflection, he produces all of the things that he did, his inventions with geodesic domes and things like that. How are we doing? See, it only lasted an hour. We have one more horoscope to look at, and it is a timely horoscope to look at. I bowed to public sentiment and took a timely horoscope. Yeah, I tried to get as many women as men, but it's difficult sometimes to do that. You can spend hours and hours and hours searching. Yeah. All right. This is the horoscope of Whitney Houston. We can see that Moon and Jupiter are in the 1st house. She had a very positive, religious, generous childhood. That's, it's as positive as you can get. And they trine the Sun, and they trine Venus by association, not always directly. What I think may have happened is that from childhood on, she was spoiled by it all. And she didn't have a realization of how hard things could be. Because it came easily to her, even though she had plenty of hard stuff in her life to deal with, because the Sun and Venus square Neptune, and they oppose Saturn. But the Neptune and the Saturn are in houses that are hidden, and she didn't see those problems. Now, alcoholism and addiction are ruled by Pisces and the 12th house. And that is co-ruled by, I'm talking in abstract now, and Pisces and the abstract 12th house are ruled by Neptune and Jupiter. And what happens, one of the greatest problems with addiction and alcoholism is false confidence. And with the 1st house that she has and having the trine, she has a false confidence of the type, like I'm sure we've all run into those people that say, I can quit smoking pot, I've done it 50 times in my life. And she probably says to herself, I can overcome this anytime I want. It's that kind of optimism. The fact that it is in fixed signs, the T-square, is that it is very deep. It's not easily fixed. And the fact that it is that two of the planets in the T-square are in the 8th and 12th house show that it's escapist. Those are houses that often people go to escape. And clearly the 6th house means that it's going to seriously affect her health. So it's a funny thing. She had a blessed life, and she escaped into a hard life. Strange, it's the negative image that she has with the sun opposite Saturn. It's almost like she's punishing herself, and it worked that way. In any case, we're looking at the second trine of the moon to the sun, and this appears to be the way it worked. It didn't work to her advantage. She had the talent, very clearly had the talent, but it was sort of living off of the fat of the land and living off of her great success in childhood or in early life, and just sort of coasting from there. And you can't do that, especially when you have problems like that. And so what she did is she coasted herself into a life of illness and eventual early demise. Yeah.
How might she have escaped this situation?
She, as strange as it may seem from her partner, she could have done a lot with it. If she had partnered, or if she had a co-counselor that she could work with as an equal, she could have controlled the Neptune part of it, because the Pluto and Mercury are there, so that there is adequate will and with good persuasion that she could have overcome her situation. This was not necessarily a life that had to lose. Jerry?
I was going to ask is,
Oh, these conjuncts and trines.
when you have a trine like this,
Yep.
especially one of this nature in these signs,
Yeah.
is it most likely that you are going to, what we're going to say is, not necessarily waste your life, but lay back and take it easy?
The second trine, it's more likely, yes. Especially with the sun being in Leo, because Leo likes to take it easy anyway. Only hard-nosed cases that set up real tough lives for themselves don't take it easy with Leo.
I was
Yeah. Yes.
curious because, in trines you always say it's that they have accomplished something already.
Yeah.
And the thing is,
Yeah. This is a separating trine as well as being a second trine.
Except for that, those squares from Neptune, the opposition to, oh yeah, they're both from Jupiter.
Yeah.
That I would never
But
expect.
she really did shine. When you saw her when she was young, she really did shine. She was a beaming, fiery sign.
Where's the voice coming from?
Usually Venus. Venus usually rules the voice. The spoken word is ruled by Mercury, but
Maybe the progression started
singer.
squaring her sun and Venus and all, I think.
I didn't take time to look at all of
No,
that.
I'm just thinking, what could have touched it off in her?
All right, that's it. Next week is mysticism week. Yeah, was it?
I don't know much about this, but I still like hearing about it.
Okay.
Martha's taught me a little.
Okay.
Wonder twin powers activate.
And again, your name is?
Carol.
Carol, that's right. All right, I should always remember Carol's. You're not a Sagittarius, are you?
For me?
No.
My sister was a Sagittarius, Carol. And there's been several times that I've been smitten with Sagittarius Carols.
Sorry.
Because,
Are you turned off by those?
no,
Except for Richard.
what?
I'm just going to roll my earring collection through this. Yeah.
People love
people love these. They're like,
You must have showered just before you came because you have a really